And Assemblyman Williams, I fully understand that point, and I think as you'll hear throughout the rest of our testimony, the need for greater coordination, cooperation, and communication is one of our central recommendations from the industry, and that's from the state level with OES down to our local PSAPs and even across technology. So I share in that concern. Along with that voice call, the callback number, and the initial caller location estimate comes to the PSAP, and that comes via different routes. So there may be technical problems on that. Let me just talk about that initial caller location estimate. And I'm going to speak generically here because it varies between carriers. Some carriers are able to determine an initial caller location estimate with greater accuracy and greater speed than other carriers. I know for AT&T, the way our network is set up, we require to get a final most accurate location estimate, we require 20 seconds or more in some cases. And that's why one of the recommendations that you'll hear me make later on is, as part of a PSAP education and continued training recommendation, make sure that a rebid is done every time, because the ability and the quality of that initial location may vary from carrier to carrier. And if the PSAP call taker does not realize that telecommunication professional doesn't understand that, they may think they have a better location than they in fact do. And again, that's a PSAP training point. Once the wireless carrier's delivery of this information ends and it's turned over to the PSAP's network, the public safety network, that information, the voice, the callback information, the initial location estimate, all has to be delivered to the call taker, to the 911 professional that actually receives that call. Again, that's a potential point of failure, or at least a potential point for upgrade if we're talking about older customer equipment that may require additional funding to have either an upgrade in hardware, software, or both. Once that 911 operator has the information on their position in front of them, the PSAP operator has to adhere to appropriate procedures, such as that rebid procedure and anything else that is particular to that call and that job. So again, I run you through this not to take up excess time, but to make sure that everybody understands that this is a complex interrelationship, and frankly, any point along the way where there is a challenge, that challenge can result in delays and inaccuracy in terms of location. Over the past 20 years, the wireless industry, in partnership with public safety and federal authorities and state and local authorities, have deployed increasingly effective 911 location technologies in its networks and handsets. The most recent set of FCC regulations, released within the past 2 months, mandates that carriers develop technologies that will provide accurate 911 location estimates for callers inside buildings, where RF, which is what drives all of this radio frequency energy, is a lot more challenging to pick up and triangulate from, and to continue at the same time as they're developing those indoor location estimate capabilities, to continue to improve outdoor location estimates according to the rules that the FCC set forth in 2011, which in turn were an updating of several series of orders that have been coming from the FCC on the industry since 1996. I will disagree with Assistant Director Wong on one part of her testimony. From a wireless industry perspective, we have been for nearly 20 years under a series of very stringent and appropriately so regulations that have forced us to develop technology that didn't exist at the time, develop it, test it, and sustain it. So I think if we look at a 20-year arc, are we where we want to be? No. Has there been serious progress over the course of those 20 years? Yes. And are we committed to making more progress? Absolutely. We'd be happy to provide members with a more detailed explanation of the relationship of these indoor and outdoor location estimates in a follow-on document that we'd ask to submit to the committee. But for purposes of our testimony here today, within 2 years, 40% of all indoor wireless E911 calls have to be located within 50 meters or 164 feet of the caller's actual location. Within 5 years, that percentage of 50-meter, 164-foot indoor location estimates increases to 70%, and a year later increases to over 80%. Over that same 6-year period, wireless carriers have committed to develop and deploy either an altitude component, the so-called Z component to the X and Y of latitude and longitude to these indoor location estimates, or a dispatchable address, to use the term of art of the 911 caller, for delivery to PSAPs. And going back to Ms. Wong's discussion about the landline era, where PSAPs knew that there was a piece of copper wire that terminated at a validated address. We're not going to be able to get to that level of precision, but we are committed as an industry to get to a dispatchable address so that first responders know which door on which floor and what part of that floor their aid is needed. That's in the regulations, that's what we've committed to, and that's what we will be delivering. This new federal regulatory framework builds on the progress made since 1997. It's certainly aggressive, but it is achievable, assuming the current trend in location development continues. However, it is critical that the committee and the folks here in California on the public safety and in the general public understand that the ability to achieve these 911 system performance improvements, especially with respect to indoor location, do not exist now, and it will take significant time or development effort to design, test, and deploy those capabilities. It will also take time for older handsets to be replaced with newer handsets that can support these objectives through use of GPS and other navigational systems, and it will also take time for PSAPs to ensure that their equipment can support these new functionalities. Again, you're talking about adding a third component to that location. The history of 911 as a public safety tool demonstrates the importance of allowing technology on both sides of the emergency calling system to evolve and mature. Since the first 911 call was placed in 1968, public safety, state and local governments, federal government, and telecommunication carriers have worked together to achieve the remarkable evolution in 911 access that has already occurred and that will continue and must continue as we continue in the 21st century. For example, as wireless carriers work on improving our part of the puzzle, PSAPs around the country are creating true next-generation NG911 functionality. This is, again, another network of network. Efforts and progress are being made here in California, but it's an area of focus on the public safety side that has to be supported through that collaborative and cooperative effort between industry, government, and public safety. As an industry, we agree with Ms. Wong that it's a good idea to urge the public to know their location wherever it's possible. And as noted before, we do believe that the existing federal regulatory scheme is not only sufficiently aggressive, but is at the level that technology will be able to be developed and met. That does not preclude us and does not mean we are not interested and committed to working cooperatively with every stakeholder here in the state of California, from the governor's office to the legislature to the various executive branch down to local PSAPs. We want to be and continue to be a part of the solution here in California. As OES and the legislature consider any 911 issue here in California, all stakeholders should focus on cooperative, collaborative efforts that will generate long-term, sustainable improvements across the state. One concrete step to be taken today is to include telecoms reps on the 911 advisory board in a permanent position. I think we have the ability to appear at the request of the 911 advisory board. But again, if you think about the system of systems is broken into two halves, if you don't have continuing representation from the front end, I would argue that the decisions being made on the back end are not as well as informed as they might need to be. Deploying NG911 and its new capabilities across the state will be just as important to Californians in crisis as the new cell phone technology to improve indoor location estimates and our ongoing outdoor accuracy improvements. Equally important will be providing ongoing public education opportunities to ensure that residents and visitors alike understand the appropriate action to take in an emergency situation. The wireless industry supports the objective of AB 510 to provide information to the legislature on the progress being made in California to improve the state's 911 systems in a holistic manner. As part of that process, we would respectfully suggest certain areas of inquiry to make the report contemplated by AB 510 as useful as possible to all stakeholders. Ensure that 911 system issues are properly described. There's a fundamental difference between an outage that affects all voice service as opposed to an outage that takes out a component of the 911 system but leaves voice calls other than to 911 as operational. So we want to be careful with our language. We want to describe the results of prior 911 system improvements and make recommendations for their continuation or development. Project Red has been mentioned before. I'm sure there are other initiatives that need additional scrutiny. We want to investigate PSAP training programs and how they might be improved, including the need for rebids on every 911 call until all carriers can generate those quick location estimates as accurately as possible. Consider the effectiveness of current 911 public education efforts and what improvements might be made to them. Review existing 911 call routing concerns and along with the technology available to address those concerns. Explore ways to leverage PSAP technologies to reduce both costs and response times, including possibly considering PSAP consolidation where appropriate. Collect the lessons learned from various NG911 trials held both in California and elsewhere and examine their applicability across the state. Identify possible funding gaps and make recommendations for broad-based solutions. Stay engaged with the wireless industry and the rest of the telecoms industry at both the technical and policy levels with regard to all substantive 911 discussions here in California. Again, we thank the committee and the legislature for this opportunity to come and speak on that topic. Finally, focus on long-term improvements on a statewide basis. In closing, the wireless industry, we are proud of the wireless E911 progress that has been made here in California over the past 20 years. We look forward to working with all stakeholders to further improve this important public safety infrastructure. Moving forward, we urge the legislature to support all 911 stakeholders in working cooperatively and collaboratively with each other and keeping Californians safe. Finally, the upcoming wireless E911 development and deployment efforts that our industry will undertake must be mirrored by California's PSAPs as they accelerate their progress towards statewide NG911 availability. We believe that the report contemplated by AB 510 will help advance that progress. We thank the opportunity for the committee to provide this input, and we look forward to continuing to work with the legislature and our fellow public safety stakeholders across government and the public in making California's 911 system the best that it can be. I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Peter. I think we have a question by Member Williams.
Sure. Is it technically and economically feasible for the telecommunications companies to exceed the federal mandates on location accuracy in this state and the timetable for that accuracy?
From an industry perspective, I'll return to my testimony statement and say, and I will quote myself. Forgive me, because this is a central point. The ability to achieve the 911 system improvements contemplated by the federal regulatory system at present, they do not exist. They do not exist, and they will have to be developed. That does not mean that.
In other words, you can't say because the technology has not been.
That's exactly right. The federal regulations are aspirational, and we have to build what has been said we must build.
So because of the problems in location accuracy, there's other ways to improve or mitigate that through better routing, through speeding up of transfer of who is the primary PSAP responsible for our tower or others. Is the industry willing to consider other ways to mitigate that lack of accuracy in the meantime, a la better routing of calls?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the critical pieces of our recommendation, is that we need, frankly, more engagement with OES and other stakeholders to make sure that left hands know what right hands are doing, both halves are functioning together, and that each side knows where the problem points are, where the challenge points are, and what the plan to resolve those problems and challenges. We're absolutely committed to working together.
And you're willing to do that even if it costs some more money? I mean, the part of it is a funding question, right?
I think identifying the funding issues that are associated with these challenges is a critical task, and we want to be a part of that identification of those funding issues. The resolution of those funding issues, I'm going to have to defer to you folks in the legislature, but that is something that I think needs more study, is where are the gaps, what are the dollars associated with the gaps, and how do we fill those gaps?
Great. Steve, you had a question?
Yeah, one point I wanted to make, Mr. Chair, thank you, is that underlying all this is and Peter referenced it, this is a network of networks. Each wireless carrier has its own network, so therefore, the kind of the collaboration and the combining of it is part of that challenge. Having said that, wireless is nothing more than physics, and it has to run on adequate infrastructure. And adequate infrastructure, and I know a lot of you guys at the local level have dealt with this time after time, are cell sites. And some folks are troubled by it and would prefer not to deal with it, not you guys. But in order for public safety to work as well as it can, it's got to be able to have calls go through. Wanted to bring your attention to a bill that Mr. Quirk has this year, AB 57, whose intent is to make some at least incremental streamlining to the local approval process, which has frankly been a real challenge in lots and lots of communities. So we bring that to your attention. We will come back and talk to you about it. But underlying the ability of public safety to work is making sure that the facilities are there that can accept the calls that are given.